Joining me now from London is the spokesman for the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group, James Polk. Also in the UK, Natasha Ezrow. She is a professor of Latin American politics at the University of Essex and the author of Dictators and Dictatorships, Understanding Authoritarian Regimes and Their Leaders. And in San Jose, California, Nicaraguan activist Brandon Quintanilla. Thanks all so much for joining us. I'm going to start with you, James. In London, you feel the government of Daniel Ortega has served its people quite well. You've also said that reports of police using excessive force, you find them rather hard to believe. If that's the case, why is the perception from outside so different?
I think that I haven't said that the police haven't used excessive force. There certainly seems to be evidence that they have, although it's a bit of a mystery why they would have done, because the police has been a very trusted institution in Nicaragua for a long time. I'm into Granera until a few days ago. The chief of police in Nicaragua has regularly been voted one of the most popular people in the country, and community relations between police and the general public in Nicaragua have been very good in what is the safest country in Latin America and one of the safest countries in the hemisphere. But clearly, there has been a sudden outbreak of violence, and there does seem to be strong evidence that the police have used excessive violence, including the use of weapons.
Okay, but tell us then your take on Ortega's government. It's being criticized heavily now, particularly by some of the protesters we've seen in the streets, as well as by some forces in the international media. Why do you think his government has been effective and good for the Nicaraguan people?
Well, at the time that the government came back to power, the FSLN, the Sandinista party, came back to power in 2007, the country was in a considerable mess. There were power cuts on a daily basis. A large part of the country was cut off from basic services, sanitation, general utilities. That has massively improved. The country has been growing regularly over the last 7 or 8 years, an average of about 5% per year. There's been a very good tripartite agreement between the government, business leaders and the trade unions to make sure that the country works well, to support private enterprise, whilst at the same time allow the possibility of a great deal of attention to supporting social programs and alleviating poverty. I mean, poverty has been cut by 50%, from 48% to 24.9% over the last 10 years. Extreme poverty has been cut by more than that. There have been huge programs supporting people, providing support for women in particular. Nicaragua is now, according to the World Economic Forum, the 6th best country in the world for gender equality, up from 88th in 2007. So there are massive areas where things have improved. I think maybe where the problem is that a certain amount of complacency has come in. The opposition is very weak, and for a well-functioning democracy, you actually need a strong opposition. So I think there have been probably certain cases where there have been abuses of power and sectors of the community that feel that they've not been supported by the government where they should have been.
Okay, Brandon, let me ask you, you're in California now, but most of your family, from what I've understood, is still in Nicaragua. Having heard what James just said, I mean, does Daniel Ortega deserve what looks to be more and more like an uprising to remove him from power?
I can agree on the fact that he should be withdrawn, only because of all the things that I'm hearing constantly from my family members, because I have family members that are attending the universities, and they're the ones doing the non-violent protesting. So one of my cousins was actually assaulted for doing non-violent protesting, aggressive through the police force. And so that kind of led to him getting arrested, and due to the fact that he's speaking up and voicing his opinions about the corruption of what they feel about what they felt was incorrect, what they did. So in my input, I feel like he should be withdrawn.
Okay, but Brandon, let me ask you, you say, you're talking about the corruption and what they feel the government did. Is it about corruption? Do they disapprove of Ortega's administration? Or were they mad at what was initially the cause of these protests and those cuts to Social Security and welfare?
Yeah, it's the cuts for sure. I mean, if you're a retired person that's already living in a country of poverty, which compared economically to where we come from, like in the United States, if you have your pension, it's a lot of hard-earned money. But in a country where it's already poverty, it's not a lot of money in comparison. So having 5% being withdrawn after doing all your hard work and labor to contribute to the economy, and seeing how that plays out, it's just unfortunate. So
okay, but now that
that
Ortega has repealed those cuts, he's gone back on that. Shouldn't he be able to reconcile?
He could, but it varies because there's a lot of confrontation that the people are asking for, and solutions on how they can go about about the tension with the Sandinistas and the actual government itself.
Okay, let me get to Natasha now. I mean, what do you see has happened here, and where do you think this is going?
In some ways, it's surprising that that there were protests in Nicaragua because, as it already been stated, Nicaragua had been pretty stable for many years, and there were growth rates, and it was attracting a lot of FDI. But in other ways, it's not very surprising because Ortega's regime has become more and more personalized, more like a family dictatorship, which is sort of reminiscent of the Somoza years, which is exactly what the Nicaraguan people would not want. And corruption levels have grown over the years. And he seems to be grooming his wife, who's now the vice president, to take over eventually. And there's just this feeling that really high levels of nepotism and cronyism in Nicaragua. And so we'll see how things play out because he seems to be wanting to concede to these protests and at least take back what initially started the protest. But the bigger problem is for Nicaragua's future is that there isn't really a fair playing field in these elections. And so if he's doing such a good job, he should allow elections to be run fairly and allow international observers to actually observe these elections.
And I mean, I do very much understand that criticism that perhaps opposition hasn't been allowed to flourish in a way that it should, but there's also the question, is there a good enough opposition? Is there a political alternative to Daniel Ortega, or is he the best Nicaragua can do?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is, so he used to be more of a leftist, and he's moved to the center more. And so he occupies a large sort of ideological space. Then the other issue, he's been really successful at dividing and conquering the opposition. And so he's been able to co-opt them at times, repress them at times, provide different carrots and sticks to the opposition so that they really pose no real threat to him. And honestly, he probably could win an election without having to resort to all these dirty tricks that he does. And so that's another issue, that the opposition might need to take note of what's taking place and, move forward with this.
Okay, I mean, James, let me ask you, do you think Ortega can kind of take these protests? Is he at the point now where he can take these protests as a warning shot and claw back kind of, the support that he may have lost, maybe apologize to the public, not let his wife use so many derogatory terms for the protesters, for example, calling them delinquents and vampires? Is it still possible for him to redeem himself now and become the leader that Nicaragua wants him to be and that you obviously think he was?
Well, I think so. As the old Sandinista Jaime Wheelock has been quoted recently saying the thing about Daniel is when he's wrong, he backs down. I think he does want to cooperate. He's a very canny politician. He doesn't stand on his pride. And I think it's very important for him to find a genuine solution. I mean, I think he's also a very genuine politician. He genuinely wants the best for his people. No doubt he's been very shocked by this. I mean, I would agree with some of what Natasha says and not other things. I mean, I think the idea of Daniel Ortega as being somewhat authoritarian and anti-democratic, which has been claimed to a greater or lesser degree by the media in the West, is not really correct. There are certain irregularities. The weakness of the opposition is largely down to the opposition, who can't seem to agree on pretty much anything. So it's been very easy for the FSLN to create a dominant position in the polls, especially given that their policies tend to benefit the majority of the population. But I think the main question is where it goes from here. The question of whether the dialogue and the Truth Commission, which has been set up to try and deal with these issues, whether they are genuine, whether Ortega can make sure that everybody makes a genuine contribution, and whether things really change as a result.
And let me pick up with Brandon again then there. I mean, where does this go from here? Right now, these protests are strong. They're largely peaceful. But there really are, what's so interesting about it, there really are no movement leaders. This is all civic-led protests. I mean, everyone seems to be equally involved across the board. So what would your alternative be as a Nicaraguan? What do you want to see change?
Well, it's a very good question, because there's a lot of areas that there's a lot of tension being brought upon. You know, you have the police that are trying to they're trying to calm the activists, they're trying to calm the protesting, but then the protesters feel like there's a lot that needs to be voiced, and I feel like there's a lot of things going on that's kind of making it difficult for everyone to coincide and work side by side. So for me, it's kind of like, you know, actually respecting the ones that are actually trying to rehabilitate the communities, because there's a lot of people in the communities that are trying to obtain awareness. They're raising campaigns. They're obtaining resources from the United States, food, water, and resources. But, you know, I've seen content. I have family members that have identified people looting, but not even just the Sandinistas, but there's actually, you know, police that are actually coming in and taking some of the resources. And there's actual content and footage from people that I have that actually operate nonprofit businesses back home that have been victims to that. So it's very controversial, because you have different angles and different people not really working coincide together. So
right, and what you're talking about, in a sense, has something to do with some kind of criminal elements in the community, and just individuals that behave badly. That's not really the government's problem, though. Am I correct in hearing you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just me raising awareness to the Sandinistas, because for me, I'm still learning more about how the Sandinistas are playing their part on the corruption in this situation, because they're the ones inflicting all the chaos and all the violence. And, you know, it's also the police are getting them confused from the rest of the civilians, because you can't really separate the two. So, I mean, there's just, from my standpoint, is just President Ortega just has to be genuine about his approach on what he wants to do and his solution.
Okay.
Because, you know, there's a lot of spotlight on him right now. So,
Natasha, let me ask you this. I mean, we're just trying to get a better picture for our viewers that are unfamiliar with Nicaragua. How divided is the country right now?
Well, it's hard to say, right, because there were protests that recently happened that I guess he and the Sandinistas orchestrated that were in favor of the government. If you took the last election as free and fair, which it probably wasn't, but just to look at how popular he was in the last election, Ortega won with 72% of the vote. And the previous election, 5 years before that, he won with 62% of the vote. So he probably has some genuine support, because there are a lot of people that work for the state and, you know, and work for the government that basically feel that they've been beneficiaries of the regime. But the issue that initiated with the students was just being fed up with the style of rule and what the future was going to look like for them, just let alone the fact that their pensions could be cut and there's higher taxes, so there's basically less services being offered. But just the nature of the regime was becoming more and more personalized, with it becoming more of a family dynasty. So just to answer the question of how divided it is, it does look fairly divided at the moment, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a potential solution if there's an adequate response to the reforms, and also just sort of an easing towards more democracy on behalf of the Ortega regime, improving press freedoms, and also just allowing a more level playing field for opposition candidates to run.
Okay.
And then also just providing more transparency.
Okay, let me ask James then, as an Ortega supporter, I mean, what steps do you think he should take now? And I want to bring up the point that Natasha raised, is that there's no real proof of this yet, but many people suspect he's just grooming his wife, almost Mugabe-like, to take the reins of power when he steps aside. So what should he do now?
Well,
I can imagine you don't think that would be okay, to hand the reins and keep this like a family dynasty, or do you?
No, I think it was a grave mistake to appoint her as vice president, or as the vice presidential candidate, and then to run on his ticket. Most countries have either laws against that or certainly disapprove of it, although the President of the United States has slightly fallen foul of that with his son-in-law. But certainly I think it's a bad idea. Rosario Murillo was quite popular before, I think, but her popularity has gone down, and I think it's possibly been held below the waterline as a result of
And he needs to recognize
protests.
That, correct?
I think he needs to recognize that, and I think she probably needs to step back, and I think we probably need to be looking for younger people within the FSLN movement, which is, I mean, obviously it's a very large organization with a huge number of people involved, so there would be candidates who would come through. I think one of the issues is that few of the other members of the FSLN have anything like the recognition factor of the two who are currently at the top, and the main figures from the past who were significant, maybe those who were actually active in the revolution back in 1979, are old or retired or
right.
no longer with us. So I think I think one of the things that needs to come out of this is a regeneration in terms of the leadership of the FSLN. I mean, I would also slightly like to comment on Natasha's thing about suggesting that Ortega is suppressing the opposition and that it's not free and fair elections. There are certainly irregularities with the elections. The Organization of American States has presented a report. A delegation is currently in Nicaragua discussing with the government how to implement them. The government is doing its best to implement revisions to the electoral system to make sure that the elections are as free and fair as possible. And it's also not true to say that there haven't been international observers. There have just been certain observers from certain countries who have been restricted.
Okay.
So I think the weakness of the opposition and
I'm just very quickly, James, we're down to kind of our last minute, and I want to get to Brandon too, but there was something that really struck me in these protests that I thought this must really hurt Ortega to hear from protesters. One of their slogans that they were chanting was, Ortega, Somoza son la misma cosa, saying that the man he fought against, Somoza, the dictatorship that he risked his life to fight against, now they are the same thing. That must have hurt him.
Yes, well, I mean, I don't know what the context of that is, or how widespread that was. I presume that it was done as an angry protest because it specifically hurts. The idea that there is any comparison between a dictator who allowed no elections, who tortured and killed his own people, and siphoned off hundreds of millions of dollars which were given in aid to the country after the 1970s earthquake and so on, with a man who has led a government which has supported social programs, cut poverty and so on. The comparison is clearly absurd. Clearly Ortega's government has made mistakes. I hope that they will now be able to address those and genuinely take into account the wishes of the protesters. If they can do so, then hopefully that will alleviate the situation. Otherwise, there is a danger. There's also the danger of the right wing exploiting this situation, and there are suggestions that the right wing may have been involved in some of the violence in the protests.
Okay. Brandon, I just want to hear from you, since you are the Nicaraguan on the panel. You're a member of the young generation. Are you looking forward to the future of the country? Do you want to return to Nicaragua to be with your countrymen?
Definitely. You know, going back every other year, visiting family. You know, the culture in Nicaragua is amazing, but you know, seeing from what it's transitioned to, it's really been hard to keep quiet and not really speak up against this. I really don't get political in this instance, but just due to the fact that there's family being affected and seeing how poverty has already been an issue. You know, I have family members that sleep under roofs that you can see right through. So, you know, living in those circumstances and already dealing with the tension that already exists in a regular space and seeing how it amounts to now that there's tension coming from all angles, it's a very difficult circumstance to really deal with. And that's why SOS Nicaragua has been the hashtag that has been raising awareness to this situation. So for me, I want to go back to my country, even if it is anytime soon, just to keep raising awareness, because it's just something that's really unfortunate. And I really hope that things get adjusted and it's really soon.
Okay. I'd like to thank James, Natasha, and Brandon all so much for joining us on this edition of the Newsmakers.